I want to welcome you to Back to Basics. What we're doing is I'm going to address credit, how you establish good credit, what makes up a good credit score. When I refer to credit score, it's a point I don't emphasize enough. There is no one credit score. There is no one credit scoring model. It's like taking your temperature. You know there's one number, 98.6. But with credit scores, it doesn't work where there's only one thermometer taking your temperature. There are many different thermometers, but the same score is the best score. 850 is the equivalent to 98.6 with a thermometer. I'd like for you to set up credit monitoring and review of your score and your report for free with Credit Karma and Credit Sesame. You do these things, you're able to track it, they'll guide you how to improve your score. And just remember, first rule always, pay every bill every month on time. If you think that what you earn on a job has anything to do with your credit, forget it. What you do for a job has nothing to do with your credit. The factors that matter for your credit are pretty simple in how you're graded. I'm going to give you the exact percents that these things matter on the traditional, most recognized scoring model, and that's the FICO scoring model. Number one, accounting for 35% of what makes up your credit score, that is a number up to 850, is that you pay your bills on time each and every month. Or in reverse, if you don't pay your bills on time each and every month, you devastate that 35% of your score. So if you have a perfect payment history, you've never missed a payment, you've already got 35% of the way to a perfect credit score. So there you go. That's more than a third of what makes up a score. The other 30% is based on how much of your available credit you're using. This is a concept that sometimes I seem to do a good job at, and other times, well, not as good. So I want to explain this in a way that hopefully will make sense. One of the things that the people that do the scoring model believe is that the more credit you use of the credit that's available to you, the more likely you are to default. The less of the available credit you have for you, the less likely you are to default. So that is why you'll hear me talk about utilization. And what is utilization? Simply, it means for the credit you have, how much of it are you using? So by credit you have means what your credit limit or limits add up to, that is your available credit. So let's just keep it simple and say you have total available credit of $10,000. If you are using $3,000 of that 10, you are considered to be neither good nor bad with the amount of credit you're using, and it's a neutral factor, if you will, on how you're graded as your risk of default. So 30% of your available credit is where you want to be. So in the example of $10,000 in credit, no more than $3,000 in use. And if you go above 50%, your credit score starts diving off a cliff. Now, as you go below 30%, the people that are golden, that have overall credit scores that are above 800, which is a very thin slice of people, they're using typically less than 10% of their available credit. And I want to explain something about use of available credit. Maybe 35-40% of people pay their credit card bills in full every month. You may think your utilization is 0%. The scoring model grades you on what your balance was that you're being billed for on your closing date. You have a grace period to pay it free of any interest, but your score is calculated on what that balance was when the statement closed. So people who want to get their score higher, especially when they're applying for a mortgage, will track their account online and pay the bill before it posts. So those are the two big factors. Always making payments on time and keeping the percent of your available credit you use very low. The other three factors are all minor. You get penalized when you apply for new credit, but it's a very small hit. And the length of your credit history accounts for 15% of your score. The third biggest factor besides utilization and paying on time. And so the more credit history you have, you can be judged on, you get like bonus points for that. And then the only other factor is the mix of credit. So as an example, that harms me. I only have credit cards, no car loans, no home loans. I mean, I don't do car loans. And as for mortgages, I haven't had a mortgage in forever. So the only thing I can be graded on is credit cards. And because I don't have a complete mix, I will never be able to get to a perfect credit score. That's okay. As long as you take care of those first two big factors, your score, like mine, will be just fine. It's a tough question. What's the right number of credit cards for you to have in your life? I'm Clark Howard, and I'm really cheap, but I carry plastic for a special reason.
I'm Beverly Harzai, credit card expert and consumer finance analyst for U.S. News and World Report. And that is a great question. How many credit cards should you have? I get that question all the time.
So the answer is, you have how many?
I have 4.
And is that the answer you want other people to have? Because
No.
I also have 4 personal cards. And so we ended up with the same number.
That? Yeah.
But I tell people the Noah's Ark rule, that you should always have 2 credit cards, never one, and never 2 from the same issuer. If you have 2 cards from Chase, or you have 2 cards from Citi, or you have 2 cards from American Express, as far as I'm concerned, you only have 1 card. So you want to have 2 cards from 2 different issuers. Mm-hmm. So I'll explain that in a minute, but what's your magic number?
I decide which cards to have based on the rewards and what type I need. I have a cashback card that meets my needs. I have a travel rewards card with points. I do like to travel. And then I have another card for an emergency. It's a low APR card. It's unbelievably low, below 10%. I've had this card for 20 years.
So it's interesting because you approached the reason you have 4 cards from practical uses of the card.
Yes.
I approach it from a different standpoint. And the reason I say 2 cards is because I want people to have a mix of credit, have more than 1 card. If we hit a recession and credit card companies decide they don't want you, and one of them dumps you, still have the other card. If one of them cuts back your limit, you still have another card. And so I'm thinking of it from a defensive standpoint. I'm thinking in terms of your credit score and how you're looking with that credit, and that you're protected for when the economy gets tougher, which eventually it always does. And you're talking about it from a practical standpoint. I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking, here I am saying 2 cards, Noah's Ark rule, but then how many cards did I say I had?
4.
And so here I am, I have 2 airline cards, 1 domestic, 1 international. I have 2 cashback cards. So I have gone with the same kind of strategy of how it works in my own life. So there's 2 different answers here, really, aren't there?
Yes, Clark, I think that there are. And one reason I have a couple of credit cards is because of the credit limit. It helps my credit score. So I'm always mindful of what my balances are, what my limits are, and by having 4 cards with pretty high limits, that helps me keep my score up. So I'm always thinking about that too when I think about the number of credit cards.
And that's such a brilliant point, because people ask me continually, how do I get my credit score higher? And actually, one of the ways to do it is to strategically have and how you use credit cards. So why is 4 better than my Noah's Ark rule of 2 for your credit score?
You know, Clark, I think it's better because of the credit limit opportunities there. You can raise your score up. And as you mentioned, you know, with the economy, you never know. So I think it's a good idea to have more than 2 and have them for different purposes.
There is no perfect answer as to number of cards. I would say that as we've talked, if you think of it this way, follow that initial rule I gave you. 2 cards from 2 different issuers, but maybe twice that many, 4 might be the perfect answer rather than 2 cards.
That's a good point. And you know, really the right answer is what's right for you.
So now comes the question, as Capital One would say, what's in your wallet? How do you decide what card to carry? So you have to start with the decision tree. Decision number 1. Are you paying balances in full each and every month? Or do you run balances on cards each and every month? A lot of times, if you're running balances, you intended to not do that, but life happens and you're running balances on cards. That's why, in an unusual part of human behavior, when I ask somebody who's wheezing on credit card debt, how much they owe on credit cards and what their interest rates are, overwhelmingly, people can't answer either of those questions for me, or they can answer one, not the other. Because remember, the psychological thing was you never intended to run a balance on credit cards, to be in debt on credit cards. So when you think back to basics, if you are running a balance, your job is to make sure you have the best interest rate you can possibly have on that balance, with the ultimate goal, wiping out that balance. But remember, most people don't know what interest rate they're paying, even though it's right on the statement you get every month. So I love credit unions. And if you're running a balance on a high interest rate credit card, almost always the best place to turn to lower that rate is a credit union. Credit unions are owned by, and they're there for their members. You join one, you're one of the members they're there for. And so credit unions often offer interest rates that are about a third lower than what the typical bank charges. But sometimes if your credit score is good, but you're running a balance, you'll be able to get an interest rate from a credit union on a credit card that will be below 10%. And that's the target to shoot for. In addition, you may from time to time receive a balance transfer offer where you can balance transfer a high interest rate card to one that has an interest rate holiday or a very low rate for a significant period of time, usually 6, 12, or 18 months. Now, the balance transfer offers work fine. You may, with most of them, have to pay an upfront, like a prepayment of interest charge, like a balance transfer fee that often will be 4% of the balance. But if you're on a straight line to pay it off during the interest rate holiday, then a balance transfer offer can work great. But if you know you're going to need to use cards as a borrowing mechanism, maybe because of your work cycle, or you're an independent contractor who gets reimbursed for expenses on a delayed basis, and you're going to run balances, your whole goal needs to be getting the lowest ongoing interest rate card you can. And again, going back a step, that almost always is going to be at a credit union. Now, I want to address if you do pay balances in full. But for most people who pay their balance in full and don't run big balances, and particularly if travel is not a high priority for you, a straight cashback card is best. My two favorite have not changed over the last few years. That's the Citi Double Cash Card that effectively pays you 2% cash back, and the Fidelity Investments 2% cash back card, where the money goes into an investment account, a college savings account, or a Roth IRA. Those two cards, no games, no gimmicks, just 2% cash back. That is a very high effective earning rate. And your life changes. The patterns change in your life. The card that was best 2 years ago may be an also ran now, not because the card necessarily changed its rewards, but your life changed. Your circumstances changed. But remember, burn your points before you can a card, because otherwise you'll forfeit your points when you can that card. Don't have a psychological connection to a card. This is money we're talking about, and you go to the one that's best.